are so many islands in the world, places too dangerous, too remote, or even too bizarre for anyone to call home. So these are 20 of the strangest islands that no one lives on, forgotten worlds where humanity has been driven away. Number 20. Suakin Island in the Sudan. Off the coast of northeastern Sudan and the Red Sea is Suakin Island. It's a crumbling relic of a once thriving port city. Today, it's completely uninhabited. Its coral-built architecture is slowly disintegrating under the desert sun. Its history stretches back more than 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and later Islamic traders all used it as a natural harbor. During the medieval period, it became a major stop for pilgrims traveling to Mecca and for merchants shipping gold, ivory, and slaves between Africa, the Middle East, and India. By the 15th century, it was one of the busiest ports on the Red Sea. Ottoman rule in the 16th century transformed it into a fortified city, complete with mosques, warehouses, and residences made entirely from coral, an unusual material that gave it its distinctive white glow. But prosperity faded as shipping routes changed. By the late 19th century, European colonization and the rise of nearby Port Sudan sealed its fate. When the Port Sudan opened in 1905 with modern facilities and deeper waters, traders and pilgrims abandoned Suakin almost overnight. Without maintenance, the ports began to collapse and the harsh Red Sea climate accelerated the decay. Today, it's an open-air ruin. The remains of ornate doorways, narrow streets, and crumbling mosques are still there, half buried by sand and debris. Efforts to restore it have been proposed several times. In 2017, Sudan and Turkey announced a plan to rehabilitate parts of the old city, but progress has been minimal due to the political instability there. No one lives on it now, not because it's cursed or forbidden, but because history simply passed it by. Once the beating heart of the Red Sea trade, it's now a monument to time. Wind and salt eat away at the same walls that once welcomed caravans from the Nile and ships from India. Standing on it today is like walking through a mirage, a silent city built from the ocean itself, fading back into the water that once made it thrive. Number 19. North Brother Island. Just a few hundred meters off the Bronx in New York City is North Brother Island. This is an eerie, overgrown patch of land that's just frozen. It sits in plain view of one of the busiest cities on the planet, and no one has lived here for decades. It was once home to hospitals, quarantine wards, and later a halfway house. The island is now completely off limits to the public. Its story started in the late 19th century when it was chosen as the site for Riverside Hospital, a quarantine facility for contagious diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, and typhoid. It became infamous for housing Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, who was forcibly confined there for over 2 decades after spreading typhoid through her cooking. She spent the final 23 years of her life on the island, dying there in 1938. After the hospital closed, the island was briefly used to house the returning veterans from World War II, and later in the 1950s became a rehabilitation center for young drug addicts. By the 1960s, the island was completely abandoned, with no permanent residents and no maintenance. The buildings here just fell into ruins. Because the island's closed to visitors, few people have even seen it up close. In decades, photographers granted rare access have described it as an unsettling scene of urban decay, Manhattan's skyline visible in the distance, while nature just quietly erases one of the city's forgotten chapters. It's not remote or inaccessible, it's just abandoned, left to rot and regrow in the shadow of New York. Number 18. Miyake-jima in Japan. About 180 kilometers south of Tokyo is Miyake-jima, a volcanic island that's part of Japan's Izu archipelago. From a distance, it looks peaceful. Lush forests, coastal cliffs, and small fishing harbors ringed by the deep blue Pacific. But this island holds a secret. It sits on top of an active volcano that's erupted repeatedly throughout recorded history, releasing clouds of toxic gas so deadly that at times the entire population has been forced to flee. The island is the exposed peak of a massive undersea volcano. The most recent eruption happened in the year 2000 when Mount Oyama, the island's central volcano, exploded after months of unrest. The eruption wasn't just a spectacle, it released immense amounts of sulfur dioxide gas, poisoning the air across the island. Trees withered, animals died, and the entire population of roughly 4,000 people was evacuated by the government. For nearly 5 years, no one was allowed to live on the island. Scientists monitored it from afar, measuring the gas levels that often exceeded lethal concentrations. The ground itself, too, was unstable, with vents and fissures that were releasing toxic fumes. The streets of the abandoned villages became ghostly scenes of half-empty homes, rusting vehicles and docks slowly being reclaimed by the sea. During that time, nature began to take over. Wild plants and birds returned, thriving in the absence of people even as volcanic gases continued to rise. In 2005, after the air quality did improve, the government did cautiously allow residents to return, but under a condition. Everyone on the island was required to carry a gas mask at all times in case sulfur dioxide levels suddenly spiked. Sirens were installed to warn of dangerous air conditions, and certain areas near it were declared permanent no-go zones. Even today, while about 2,000 people have resettled in the safer parts of the island, large sections remain deserted. The air here often carries a faint sulfur smell, and yellow warning signs remind people to wear masks if the wind shifts. Roads near the crater are lined with gas detectors, and abandoned neighborhoods still stand frozen in place. They are monuments to the eruption that drove everyone away. Number 17. Ilha de Camargo Grande. Just off the southeastern coast of Brazil, about 35 kilometers from the city of Sao Paulo, is Ilha de Camargo Grande. It's better known by its chilling nickname, Snake Island. The island is home to one of the highest concentrations of venomous snakes anywhere in the world. So many, in fact, that the Brazilian government has made it completely off-limits to the public. No one lives there. Only a handful of scientists and military personnel are ever permitted to enter. It covers about 60 acres, and yet it's estimated to house between 2,000 to 4,000 snakes, meaning you could find several on every square meter of ground. The dominant species of snake is the golden lancehead viper. This is a relative of the mainland pit viper, but this island version has evolved in isolation, and over time it became smaller, faster, and far more venomous. Its toxin can melt human flesh and kill a person within an hour. There's no predators here or large mammals on the island, so the vipers prey mostly on the birds that migrate from the mainland. The island's name comes from the Portuguese word for burned, because early settlers here tried to clear the vegetation with fire to establish a banana plantation. But those attempts quickly failed. The snakes made human habitation impossible. For decades afterwards, local fishermen spread stories of what happened to anyone who dared step on shore. According to some tales, entire groups vanished overnight, killed in their sleep by serpents dropping from tree branches. In the early 20th century, the Brazilian Navy built a lighthouse here on the island to warn ships away from the rocky coast, and the lighthouse keepers here and their families were the only humans to ever live there for an extended period. Their stay, however, ended in tragedy. Legend has it that the last keeper and his family were killed when snakes crawled through the windows at night. Reaching the island is dangerous, yeah, not only because of the snakes, but because of the jagged rocks and unpredictable ocean. The visitors have to wear thick boots and gloves and have to watch every step. The forest floor, branches, even the cliff sides are crawling with vipers, perfectly camouflaged against the brown and green plants. Number 16. Okunoshima Island in Japan. Hidden in Japan's inland sea, Okunoshima Island is a lush green paradise with a dark history. Today, it's best known as Rabbit Island because of the hundreds of wild rabbits that roam freely here, and visitors can take short ferry ride to feed and photograph the friendly animals. But no one actually lives there. From 1929 to 1945, Okunoshima served as a secret military facility where the Imperial Japanese Army produced chemical weapons, including poison gas. The project was classified at the highest level. Maps of the island were even removed from official records, and workers were sworn to secrecy. The gas produced here was stored in drums and later used in warfare in China during the 1930s. The plant did operate until Japan's surrender in World War II, when Allied forces ordered the destruction of all weapons and facilities. The former factory buildings were left to decay, their concrete walls cracked and covered in moss. The gas masks and rusted pipes can still be found scattered in the ruins, which are evidence of what happened here. The rabbits came later, likely introduced in the 1970s by tourists or possibly by schoolchildren during a nature program. The result is a weird contrast, an island once devoted to weapons of death, now overrun by gentle, harmless bunnies. There's a small museum dedicated to the island's wartime history, a single hotel, and a camping area, but after sunset, the island is silent, except for the sound of wind and rustling leaves. This island is an uneasy mixture of innocence and tragedy, and it makes it one of Japan's most unusual uninhabited islands. It's a place where nature, history, and memory all just collide. Number 15. Vulcan Island in Papua New Guinea. Off the northern coast of Papua New Guinea, near the town of Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, is Vulcan Island, a volcanic landform that appeared violently from the sea and just as violently destroyed the life around it. Today, it's an eerie, silent cone of ash and rock rising from the ocean. Vulcan Island didn't always exist. It was born suddenly in September of 1937, when a massive eruption tore through the seabed in Simpson Harbor. Within hours, molten material built up into a small island, a smoking, lifeless mound that continued to grow as lava and pumice accumulated. When the eruption finally stopped, the new island, named Vulcan for its fiery birth, remained. For decades afterwards, it stood as a strange curiosity in the bay, a barren volcano surrounded by blue water. The local people who had lived with the volcanic activity for generations regarded it with a mix of respect and awe. Few dared to settle there, though. Fishermen occasionally landed on its beaches to rest or explore, and over time small shrubs and grasses began to grow on the soil. But the volcano's quiet phase didn't last. In 1994, after nearly 60 years of dormancy, Vulcan erupted again, this time one of the most destructive natural events in Papua New Guinea's modern history. Without warning, it exploded, spewing ash thousands of meters into the air and blanketing Rabaul in darkness. Pyroclastic flows raced down the slopes and into the sea, vaporizing everything in their path. The ash cloud was so thick that daylight just disappeared, and the weight of falling debris caused buildings in Rabaul to collapse. Ships in the harbor were sunk by falling debris, and the air was filled with sulfur for weeks. When the eruption finally stopped, Vulcan Island had grown again, extending its shoreline and reshaping the bay. Since then, though, it's remained quiet but dangerous. The surrounding area is now a restricted volcanic zone, and scientists are constantly monitoring it for signs of renewed activity. The ground temperature here in some places is high enough to ignite driftwood, and the smell of sulfur lingers. Despite that, though, nature is beginning to slowly recover again. Some hardy plants have started to return, and birds once more circle the crater. But no one lives there, and it's unlikely that anyone ever will. Number 14. Clipperton Island in France. Way out in the eastern Pacific, about 1,100 kilometers southwest of Mexico, Clipperton Island is one of the most remote territories on the planet. Despite being claimed by France, no one permanently lives there, and only occasional scientists or expeditions visit. Clipperton is a small coral atoll. It's barely 6 square kilometers in size and shaped like a ring surrounding a stagnant, acidic lagoon. It's got no freshwater source, and the interior lagoon is undrinkable due to the high salinity. Vegetation is sparse, mostly low shrubs, and the island's only permanent residents are seabirds and crabs. In the early 1900s, it briefly supported a small settlement of Mexican workers sent to mine guano for fertilizer. That operation began around 1906, and a garrison of soldiers and their families lived there under the Mexican flag. Over the next few years, starvation, disease, and dehydration wiped out nearly everyone. By the time a U.S. Navy ship arrived in 1917, only one man and a handful of women and children remained alive. After that, the island was permanently abandoned. During World War II, the U.S. briefly used it as a weather station, but the equipment was removed after the war. And today it's a French possession, but administered remotely from French Polynesia. The lagoon is still poisonous and undrinkable, and it prevents any real habitation. However, the lack of fresh water, the intense heat, and the corrosive lagoon make it impossible to sustain life for long periods. This is a forgotten outpost that's surrounded by ocean, where time and nature have erased nearly every trace of human presence. Number 13. Deception Island. In the icy waters of the Southern Ocean, Deception Island is one of the most unusual and treacherous places. It's located near the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. It's in part of the South Shetland Islands, but unlike most of Antarctica's frozen lands, this island is an active volcano. Steam rises from the black sand beaches, the water in its inner bay is warm enough to melt snow, and the air often smells faintly of sulfur. And of course, no one lives here permanently, and it's easy to see why. The flooded interior, called Port Foster, creates a harbor surrounded by cliffs of ash and ice, and this unique geography made it an important refuge for sealers and whalers in the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the 1910s, several whaling companies had established bases here, using the island's geothermal heat to process whale oil. The rusted boilers, bones, and storage tanks still litter the shore. In the mid-20th century, scientists established research stations here, drawn by the geothermal activity and relatively mild conditions compared to the rest of Antarctica. But Deception Island proved unpredictable. In 1967 and again in '69, volcanic eruptions destroyed several bases and forced the evacuation of all personnel. Since then, permanent settlement has been deemed too risky. A few research teams visit seasonally, and small numbers of tourists arrive on expedition ships, but everyone leaves when the weather turns or seismic activity increases. Today, 2 research bases, one Spanish and one Argentine, are maintained seasonally, but no one stays year-round. Yet for scientists, it's an invaluable natural lab for studying volcanology, glaciology, and the Antarctic ecology. This island is one of those rare places where life and destruction coexist, an island that literally breathes, shifting between fire and ice. Number 12. Malden Island, Kiribati. In the Central Pacific Ocean, Malden Island, this is a lonely speck of coral and sand that belongs to the island nation of Kiribati. Though uninhabited, it was once home to ancient Polynesian settlers. Remote, sun-scorched, and without any fresh water, it does remain one of the most isolated places in the Pacific. Archaeologists have found some evidence that Polynesians lived on Malden centuries ago. Stone platforms, shrines, and house foundations still are on the land. These ruins do suggest a small but organized community, possibly between 1200 and 1500 CE. However, the lack of permanent water has likely forced them to abandon the island long before European contact. The first recorded sighting by Europeans came in 1825 when British explorer Captain George Byron, a cousin of the poet Lord Byron, named it after his ship's lieutenant, Charles Malden. In the 19th century, Malden became part of the Pacific guano boom when traders mined the island's rich deposit of bird droppings and fertilizer. Dozens of laborers lived there temporarily, but by the 20th century operations had ended and the island was deserted again. In the 1950s and 60s, though, Malden took on a darker role. The British government selected it as one of several sites for atmospheric nuclear tests under Operation Grapple. Between 1957 and '58, several hydrogen bombs were detonated over nearby Christmas Island, and Malden was used for tracking and support operations. After the tests ended, the facilities were dismantled and the island was left uninhabited. Malden's isolation, of course, makes it difficult to reach. Ships will rarely visit, and the nearest inhabited island is hundreds of kilometers away. Though small and desolate, it carries layers of history, from ancient Polynesian exploration to Cold War science. Like many forgotten islands that are scattered around the Pacific, it tells a story of human ambition that meets nature's limits, and nature is always winning in the end. Number 11. Bouvet Island, Norway. Bouvet Island is one of the most remote places on the planet. This is an ice-covered volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,600 kilometers from the nearest landmass. Officially, it's a dependency of Norway. It's often described as the most isolated island on Earth. It was first discovered in 1739 by French explorer Jean-Baptiste Charles Bouvet de Lozier, who named it after himself. For over a century afterwards, its exact location was uncertain, as rough weather and poor navigation made mapping it extremely difficult. Bouvet measured just 49 square kilometers, and 93% of its surface is blanketed by ice. The center is dominated by a small volcano, while the coastline makes it nearly impossible to land. There are no harbors here, and even modern research vessels often struggle to approach safely, and helicopter access is limited to brief, carefully planned windows when the weather allows. The only sign of human activity is an automated weather station operated intermittently by the Norwegian Meteorological Institute, and occasional visits by scientific teams. No one has ever permanently lived there, and no infrastructure exists beyond a small hut, sometimes used during research missions. In 1964, a lifeboat was discovered washed ashore on the island with no sign of crew or nearby wreckage. It's an unsolved mystery that still is puzzling historians. The environment quickly erases any traces of human presence, which makes investigation nearly impossible. But today, the island is a protected nature reserve, and despite being utterly lifeless from a human perspective, it is part of a fragile ecosystem in one of Earth's most extreme environments. This place is the definition of isolation. It's an inaccessible outpost of ice and wind, where even the simplest human presence feels out of place. Number 10. Blanquilla Island in Venezuela. About 300 kilometers north of Venezuela's mainland is Blanquilla Island, an uninhabited tropical paradise surrounded by Caribbean waters. Though it looks like the perfect resort destination with the white coral beaches and turquoise lagoons, no one lives there. The island has no fresh water, no permanent structures, and no regular transportation, leaving it untouched except for the occasional visiting diver. It covers about 64 square kilometers and it's part of Venezuela's federal dependencies. This is a collection of small offshore islands under federal control. The terrain is mostly flat and dry, covered with scrub vegetation, cactus, mangroves, and several small salt ponds dot the interior. This lack of fresh water, though, has always prevented permanent settlement. Even early explorers and fishermen who landed there could only stay briefly, relying on the stored water and food. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous peoples may have visited the island long before European contact, possibly to fish or collect sea turtles, but no permanent community was ever established. During the 18th and 19th centuries, pirates and smugglers reportedly used it as a hideout due to its remote location, but today it remains a protected natural area that's prized for its plants and animals. The surrounding reef has sea turtles, barracudas, and colorful coral species, while the beaches are nesting sites for seabirds. Because of its untouched conditions, Blanquilla has become a focus of conservation interest. Scientists view it as a living lab for studying marine ecosystems, and the Venezuelan Navy occasionally patrols the island to prevent any illegal fishing. To the casual observer, though, it might look like a paradise, a place begging for people to move in, but its dry climate and lack of fresh water keep it completely uninhabited. It's a perfect example of how even the most beautiful places on Earth can remain utterly wild. Number 9. Ball's Pyramid in Australia. Ball's Pyramid is one of the strangest isolated formations on Earth, an 1,800-foot-high spire of volcanic rock that looks like the blade of a knife that cuts through the sea. It's located about 20 kilometers southeast of Lord Howe Island, and it belongs to the Lord Howe Island Marine Park in Australia's Tasman Sea. Now, this is the eroded remnant of an ancient volcano that formed roughly 7 million years ago. At the base, the surrounding sea floor drops off rapidly into deep ocean, making landings nearly impossible. For decades, it was believed to be completely lifeless here, like a barren rock that was just sculpted by the wind and water. But in 2001, a team of Australian scientists made an astonishing discovery. While climbing the pyramid to study its ecosystem, they found a small colony of insects living beneath a single shrub. These weren't ordinary insects, they were the Lord Howe Island stick insects, thought to have been extinct for more than 80 years. The species had once lived on the nearby Lord Howe Island but was wiped out in the early 20th century when rats arrived on ships and decimated the native wildlife. The last known specimens were seen in 1920. Finding them alive on Ball's Pyramid was like discovering a living fossil. Only 24 individuals were found, the entire species surviving in a patch of vegetation no larger than a dining table. Ball's Pyramid itself remains almost entirely unexplored. Only a handful of scientific expeditions have ever reached the summit, and the first successful ascent happened in 1965. Even today, climbing the thing is tightly restricted and requires special permits from New South Wales Parks and Wildlife Service. For sailors, the pyramid, of course, has been a landmark and a warning. The sheer height makes it visible from more than 20 kilometers away, and its sharp slopes have wrecked more than one vessel. Weather, too, can change rapidly here, with waves rising several meters in minutes, making the even most cautious approaches dangerous. In an era when the planet feels mapped and measured, this lonely spire is a reminder that mystery still exists, that somewhere in the vastness of the ocean, there are still secrets hidden in plain sight. Number 8. Diego Garcia. In the middle of the Indian Ocean, about 1,600 kilometers south of India and 3,500 kilometers east of Africa, is Diego Garcia, a remote crescent-shaped coral atoll that forms parts of the Chagos archipelago. Today it's uninhabited by civilians, the native population is long gone, and technically it's not completely empty. Since the 1970s it's hosted a major U.S. military base, but beyond the runways and radar stations, it is devoid of ordinary life. For centuries, Diego Garcia was home to a small but thriving Creole population known as the Chagosians, descendants of enslaved Africans, Indians, and Malay laborers. This community grew over the generations, developing its own language, culture, and traditions. And by the mid-20th century, several hundred people lived there permanently, fishing, farming, and tending livestock. That all changed abruptly in the late 1960s. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the United Kingdom made a secret agreement to establish a joint military base there. To make room for it, the British government forcibly removed the entire Chagosian population between 1968 and 1973. Residents were told they were being relocated temporarily, but were never allowed to return. Many were transported to Mauritius and the Seychelles, where they struggled to rebuild their lives in poverty. The base occupies nearly all of Diego Garcia's 44 square kilometers. It includes those long runways, satellite communications centers, deep water docks, and warehouses. But the forced removal of the Chagosians remains one of the most controversial episodes in modern British colonial history. In recent years, international courts and human rights organizations have ruled that the expulsion was unlawful and that the United Nations has called for the islands to be returned to Mauritius. Meanwhile, nature has quietly reclaimed much of the island's outer edges. The isolation here has made it a sanctuary for marine life, even as its human history remains unresolved. It is a place from which people were removed so no civilians could remain, where life goes on behind fences and classified reports, but never in the ordinary human sense. For the Chagosians, it's not an abandoned island, it's home that was stolen and forbidden. Number 7. Hirta, St. Kilda Archipelago in Scotland. Way off the rugged western coast of Scotland, about 160 kilometers into the Atlantic, is Hirta, the largest island of the remote St. Kilda Archipelago. It is a windswept place, endless seabirds, and the ruins of stone houses that once sheltered one of the most isolated human communities in Europe. Today, no one lives there permanently, but the people of St. Kilda left in 1930, abandoning their homes to the wind and the sea. Archaeological remains show that early settlers here farmed, fished, and raised sheep, and somehow surviving the brutal weather and geographic isolation. At its peak in the 19th century, it supported around 180 people who lived in small stone cottages that faced the sea. Life was built around seabirds, especially puffins, fulmars, and gannets, which provided food, oil, and feathers. But survival here came at a cost. Cut off from the mainland by unpredictable weather and rough seas, the islanders were almost entirely self-sufficient. Disease, crop failures, and harsh winters regularly took lives, and when the younger generations began leaving for better opportunities, the population dwindled. By the early 20th century, only a few dozen people remained, and contact with the outside world increased after World War I when the Royal Navy established a small station there. Facing isolation, food shortages, and the lure of modern life elsewhere, the last 36 people petitioned the government to evacuate them in 1930. They were relocated to the Scottish mainland, ending millennia of continuous habitation. Today, the island's remains tell a story of human endurance in one of the harshest environments imaginable. The old stone houses there still dot the land, their roofs collapsing, but their walls still standing strong against the Atlantic gales. Sheep now roam freely among the ruins, descendants of the hardy breed once kept by the islanders. In the absence of people, nature has taken full control. The cliffs here are among the tallest in Britain, and they're home to over 1 million seabirds that fill the air with a constant noise. Hirta's ruins are a monument to the human will to survive, and the quiet acceptance that sometimes even the strongest communities must let go. Number 6. Howland Island, United States. In the Central Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Australia, is Howland Island, a tiny strip of coral and sand that a few people have ever seen in person. Measuring just 2.5 square kilometers, it's flat, dry, and relentlessly sun-baked. And no one lives there, of course, and there's no fresh water, vegetation, or shade, only the sound of waves and seabirds. It was first recorded by American whalers in the early 19th century and claimed by the United States under the 1856 Guano Islands Act, which allowed citizens to take possession of uninhabited islands rich in bird droppings used for fertilizer. For a brief time, the island was mined for guano, but operations stopped after the deposits were exhausted. By the early 20th century, it had returned to silence. In the 1930s, the U.S. government established a small settlement there as part of the Colonization Project, which was an effort to secure Pacific territories for aviation and communication routes. A group of young men from Hawaii were sent to live on Howland and maintained a weather station and an airstrip. It was this airstrip, called Itascatown, that was intended to be the landing site for Amelia Earhart's 1937 round-the-world flight. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan took off from New Guinea en route to Howland Island, a 4,100-kilometer flight across open ocean. They never arrived, and despite extensive searches, neither their plane nor remains were ever found. Though no one has lived on Howland for decades, it's a site of occasional pilgrimage for historians and aviators. The remains of the old airstrip are still visible from above, slowly being overtaken by vegetation. But this island is a reminder of our own limits. It's a place where dreams quite literally disappeared into the sky, an empty speck of land that witnessed one of the 20th century's greatest unsolved tragedies. Number 5. Hashima Island, Japan. Off the coast of Nagasaki in Japan sits Hashima Island. It's better known as Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island. From a distance, it does look like a massive gray warship that's floating on the water. Up close, it's a crumbling city of concrete high-rises. The island's story begins in 1810 when coal was discovered beneath the seabed surrounding it. In 1890, the Mitsubishi Corporation purchased the island and began extracting coal from the undersea mines. Over the following decades, Hashima was expanded through massive land reclamation projects until it became a self-contained city. At its peak in the 1950s, the island housed more than 5,000 people on just over 6 acres, giving it a population density higher than that of Tokyo. There were schools, restaurants, bathhouses, shops, even a rooftop garden. Life was hard here, but highly structured, centered around the mines that powered Japan's economic boom. Yet, Hashima Island also carries a dark legacy. During World War II, forced laborers from Korea and China were brought to the island to work under brutal conditions. Many suffered injuries, malnutrition, and death. After the war, the coal industry continued for several decades, but by the 1960s, Japan had begun shifting from coal to petroleum. The mine closed in 1974. They left behind furniture, tools, and personal belongings in an entire community that was frozen in time. For nearly 40 years, Hashima was left to decay. In the 2000s, interests in the island's eerie remains grew. It was recognized as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2015. And today, it's partially open to tourists through tightly controlled boat tours. From above, you can still see that it resembles a battleship steaming through the sea, hence its nickname. And on this small concrete island in the sea, nature and time are slowly erasing the evidence of an entire society that once lived, worked, and vanished. Number 4. Vorostynya, Uzbekistan. Once located in the middle of the Aral Sea, Vorostynya Island, meaning Rebirth Island, is one of the most haunting places on Earth. Today, it's not an island at all. The Aral Sea has almost completely disappeared, leaving behind an island connected to the mainland by a barren desert. What remains, though, is a landscape of toxic soil and silence. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union chose this place for one reason: isolation. Surrounded by the Aral Sea, it seemed like the perfect place to conduct biological weapons research far from any civilian population. In the 1950s, the Soviet Ministry of Defense established the Aralsk-7 facility, testing pathogens including anthrax, plague, tularemia, and smallpox. The nearby settlement housed scientists, soldiers, and their families, forming a small, heavily guarded town. For decades, the island's existence was a closely guarded secret, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the base was abruptly abandoned. Equipment, chemicals, and even pathogen samples were left behind as the workers fled. In the early 2000s, American and Uzbek scientists conducted cleanup missions to neutralize any buried anthrax spores. They decontaminated several areas, but the full extent of what remains underground is uncertain. Kantubek, the nearby town, is a ghost town. Its walls cracked, its streets buried under sand. The Aral Sea was once the world's 4th largest lake. It's lost more than 90% of its water due to Soviet irrigation projects. The former island now sits amid this wasteland, a monument to human failure. Few people ever visit today. The area is difficult to reach and the air still carries traces of contamination. The once busy island is now a silent, unintended museum of the Cold War's most secretive experiments. Yeah, the island may have been named for rebirth, but in reality, it's a place of endings, where both an ecosystem and a civilization's hubris came to ruin. Number 3. Devon Island, Canada. Way up there in the far north of Canada, above the Arctic Circle, is Devon Island. It covers more than 55,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Croatia, yet no one lives there. The reason is simple: it's one of the harshest environments on the planet. It's remote even by Arctic standards. The nearest community, Grise Fjord on Ellesmere Island, is hundreds of kilometers away. For much of the year, it's locked in darkness with temperatures plunging below -40°C, winds so strong they can strip exposed skin in seconds. In summer, the sun never sets, but the ground remains frozen solid except for a thin layer of meltwater that turns the surface into mud. It is a place beyond the limits of comfort. It's almost beyond the limits of life. Despite all this, though, it's been of enormous interest to scientists, particularly those studying space. The island's coolest feature, the Suakin crater, was created 39 million years ago when a meteorite slammed into the region, leaving behind a 23-kilometer-wide depression surrounded by fractured rock. The crater's surface is cold, dry, and desolate, and it's eerily similar to the surface of Mars. The surface of Devon Island does tell a story of geology. Its exposed rocks date back hundreds of millions of years, revealing evidence of ancient oceans that once covered the Arctic. The ground is permanently frozen to depths of hundreds of meters, which create what scientists call a continuous permafrost. Vegetation is limited to mosses, lichens, and a few hardy species of Arctic poppy. These plants survive by clinging to the edges of rocks and draw moisture from the melting ice. In the 1950s and 60s, during the Cold War, Canada briefly considered the island for a radar or weather station, but the logistics proved overwhelming. When the first scientific teams began arriving in the 1990s for the Houghton Mars project, they found a land still untouched by modern infrastructure. Everything had to be flown in by small aircraft during the brief window when the conditions allowed it, and even today, the only structures on the island are temporary research shelters. Researchers, though, have discovered microorganisms living deep within this frozen soil in environments that do mimic those of Mars's polar regions. Studying these microbes helps scientists understand how life could exist, or could have once existed, on the Red Planet. Astronauts and researchers who spend weeks there report feelings of loneliness and detachment similar to those expected on a mission to Mars. Communication to the outside world is limited to radio and satellite links, and every sound here carries in the thin, cold air, the crunch of boots on gravel, the distant growl of an ATV, and the low hum of a wind turbine. At night, under the endless Arctic sky, the silence here is absolute. Despite its desolation, though, there's something profoundly beautiful about Devon Island. On clear days, the sky glows with an intensity that's rarely seen elsewhere. The pale blue contrasts with the orange-brown rock and the white snowfields. At night, the aurora borealis sweeps across the sky in silent curtains of green and violet light, reflected in frozen pools on the tundra. It is a beauty born of absence, a beauty that exists because humans have never tamed it. For scientists preparing for missions to Mars, Devon Island is a proving ground. For everyone else, it's just a reminder that there are still places on this planet as distant and alien as any other world we might visit one day. Number 2. The Palmyra Atoll, U.S. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between Hawaii and American Samoa, lies Palmyra Atoll, a remote ring of coral islets. Palmyra is a place of contradictions, tropical paradise and haunted ruin, biological wonder and historical enigma. Its isolation has preserved this environment almost perfectly, but it's also given rise to one of the strangest and most unsettling reputations in the Pacific. The total land area is just over 12 square kilometers. There's no cities, no permanent settlements, and no airstrips in regular use. The nearest inhabited island is Kiribati, more than 2,000 kilometers away. For most of human history, Palmyra was simply too remote to matter and too difficult to reach for anyone to stay. The atoll's first recorded sighting came in 1798 when Captain Edmund Fanning, an American explorer, spotted it while sailing through the Pacific. 2 years later, it was named after another American ship, the Palmyra, which nearly wrecked on its reef. In 1862, the Kingdom of Hawaii formally claimed it, later passing it to the United States when Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1898. In 1940, the U.S. Navy constructed an airfield, dock, and radar station here, turning this quiet atoll into a busy military outpost. The combination of war ruins, rusting vehicles, and dense jungle has long fueled ghost stories here among sailors and pilots who pass nearby. In 1974, it became the site of a real and deeply disturbing event that cemented its reputation as a place of bad luck. That year, a couple named Malcolm Mac Graham and Eleanor Laverne Muff Graham sailed to Palmyra as part of a community of yacht dwellers traveling the Pacific. Months later, they disappeared. When other sailors arrived, they found evidence of violence, and years later, Muff Graham's remains were discovered buried in a metal box on one of the beaches. Another sailor, Dwayne Walker, was convicted of her murder, and the case became the subject of several books and documentaries, including the And the Sea Will Tell by Vincent Bugliosi. Today, it's owned jointly by the Nature Conservatory and the U.S. government. It's designated as a national wildlife refuge. Ecologically, it is invaluable. The coral reefs here are among the most resilient in the Pacific, and the seabird populations here are so dense their guano fertilizes the soil and creates a self-sustaining ecosystem that's rarely seen anywhere else. The few visitors often describe Palmyra as breathtaking but unsettling. There's a feeling of being utterly alone here, beyond help or witness. The silence is total, only interrupted by the surf and cries of seabirds. In the end, Palmyra Atoll is both a paradise and a warning. It embodies the fragility of human presence in places where nature reigns supreme. The war built it up, abandonment preserved it, and now science protects it. Yet through all that, the island remains what it always has been, an unreachable oasis in the middle of an indifferent ocean. And maybe that's why it endures, because in the heart of the Pacific, Palmyra reminds us that some corners of the earth are meant to belong only to themselves. Number 1. Antipodes Island, New Zealand. Far to the south of New Zealand, beyond the waves of the Southern Ocean, lies Antipodes Island, one of the most remote and eerily beautiful places on Earth. No one lives there, and few have even set foot on it. It sits more than 860 kilometers southeast of New Zealand's South Island. It is one of the few truly untouched corners of the planet. It's an island that feels almost like another world. Antipodes Island is part of New Zealand's sub-antarctic islands, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The main island covers just over 20 square kilometers, and it's surrounded by a handful of small rocky islets. Winds here can reach hurricane strength, and rain or mist falls on more than 300 days a year, and temperatures rarely climb above 10 degrees Celsius, even in summer. It's not simply inhospitable, it is actively hostile to human comfort. The island is home to the rare Reischek's parakeet and the Antipodes Island parakeet, the only parrots on Earth that have adapted to life this far south. Along the coast, colonies of penguins and seals crowd the rocks, their cries mingling with the sound of the surf. This isolation that now protects these animals once drew people for very different reasons. In the early 1800s, sealing vessels from Britain and America began arriving in the region, drawn by the rich population of fur seals. The trade was so intense that by 1820, seal populations were nearly wiped out, and the island was abandoned. Over the next centuries, it was visited only occasionally by castaways, scientists, and a few unlucky shipwrecks. One of the most dramatic happened in 1893, when the British ship Spirit of the Dawn was wrecked on the island's northern side. The survivors spent months stranded, surviving on the penguin meat and melted rainwater until rescue finally arrived. In recent decades, the island has become a success story for conservation. For nearly 2 centuries, invasive rats, brought in by 19th century sealing ships, devastated the local bird population, eating eggs and chicks, and in 2016, after years of planning, New Zealand launched the $1 Million Mouse Project, one of the most ambitious island restoration efforts in the world. Helicopters dropped carefully measured doses of poison bait across the island, eliminating the rats entirely. The effort was declared a success 2 years later, and since then bird populations have rebounded dramatically. Today, Antipodes Island is entirely uninhabited and completely protected. The air is filled with the sound of seabirds and the roar of the ocean, but otherwise, it's a world of silence and solitude. Antipodes Island is not uninhabited because it was forgotten. It's uninhabited because it was never meant to be conquered. It endures on its own term, shaped only by the wind, sea, and time, in a world where almost every place has been claimed, charted, and connected. Antipodes remains defiantly apart,